Hello. We're doing the optimization of authentication techniques. My name is Tom Hitz. And
I'm
my
Jay
other
Strahler.
I'm Xavier Esquilin.
I'm Michael Dorsainvil.
And I am Patrick Dawkins.
So in order to evaluate authentication techniques and procedures, we must decide and agree what is important when considering a particular authentication system. In order to stratify authentication phenomena, our ambition was to answer the following questions about each topic: their suitable deployments, their cost of implementation, their known vulnerabilities, and their user experiences. The phenomena that we will explore are radio frequency identification, fingerprint readers, facial recognition, iris recognition, and two-factor authentication. Let's begin with RFID. Radio frequency identification is a wireless technology that is becoming ubiquitous in modern applications. They are utilized in a wide assortment of industries and organizations, both commercial and government. The process in which RFID works is when an RFID tag is in the range of a reader, the tag will communicate a small amount of data that indicates the presence or identity. RFID is inherently invisible to the user due to the wireless radio frequency technology. RFID tags can be embedded in just about any ordinary object provided the object does not restrict the range of the radio frequency and does not require a physical opening for power or a network connection. Deployments for RFID. RFID authentication falls under what a user has. There's a misconception that RFID is a glorified barcode system, which is dangerously limiting the possible sectors for RFID. Fields that dominate RFID implications are mainly industrial. You can find RFID implementations in several network supply chains such as Walmart and Target. The Department of Defense has announced several RFID initiatives to include already embedded into service members' common access cards for authentication into sensitive systems. There is virtually no limit on the amount of security that can be engineered into the authentication system to include public key cryptography and multi-factor authentication. The cost of RFID. One of the most appealing features of RFID is the cost. When RFID started, the cost was about $1 or more per unit. An initiative started by the Auto ID Center at MIT partnered with more than 100 companies and organizations to make RFID more cost effective. We now enjoy distribution of RFID tags at approximately 5 cents per unit. This makes RFID an affordable option for almost any application. RFID vulnerabilities. From an information security point of view, RFID communications model is analogous to the TCP networking model. There are similar vulnerabilities as TCP configured networks. NIST recommends the use of firewalls between the RFID database and the organization's IT systems. Encryption of RFID signals authentication to identify approved users, and shield of RFID tags to prevent unauthorized skimming of information is also recommended. Attacks on RFID can be stratified into 4 basic attack groups: attacks on authenticity, attacks on integrity, attacks on confidentiality, and attacks on availability. The RFID user experience. RFID has met criticism in the press and through privacy rights organizations, which have caused some to hesitate implementation in areas where it interfaces with consumers. Based on research, 6 major privacy concerns can be discerned. 1. Fear of losing control over one's belongings. An example of this is, it is no one's business that I bought an item. 2. Tracking of objects and people. That's self-explanatory. 3. Responsibility for objects. I bought the product causes pollution, I cause pollution. 4. Technology paternalism. I want to buy caviar, but the computer says that's not for you because they recognize that I am a budget-minded consumer. Information collection and personalization. My neighbors notice that I am classified as low budget. And then finally, abuse, the potential for spying or blackmail.
Fingerprint reader introduction. Fingerprints have long been used as a form of authentication, predating their use in digital multi-factor authentication by hundreds of years. The ability to identify individuals by unique fingerprints was actually established first in the 18th century. Fingerprints are one of the most widely used characteristics in systems that recognize a person's identity. while fingerprint reader technology is one of the more common multi-factor authentication technologies, it is not necessarily suitable for all deployments. Next slide. Fingerprint readers are commonly used in a wide variety of MFA deployments, and the suitability of which depends on a number of factors, most notably security concerns, risk tolerance, availability of fingerprint reader hardware, and the other authentication factors that are in use in the MFA deployment. All biometric authentication methods carry with them an inherent risk of false positives and false negatives. False positives being a person is incorrectly authenticated and allowed to access an item, and a false negative is the case where a legitimate user is not given the access through technological failure. Next slide. Fingerprint reader cost of implementation. The cost of implementing fingerprint reader technologies in deployments can vary widely depending on the infrastructure that's already in place, the technology that is going to be used, and other factors. Fingerprint reader implementations often utilize existing hardware, such as smartphones or laptops, which already include built-in fingerprint readers, and that can greatly reduce or minimize the cost of adding a fingerprint reader to your multi-factor deployment. Recent developments have also created low-cost fingerprint readers that have significantly reduced cost and opened up fingerprint readers to a much wider deployment range than was possible even 5 to 10 years ago. Next slide. Like all forms of biometric authentication, fingerprint authentication is susceptible to false acceptances in which a user is incorrectly matched and authenticated as another user. Given the inherent risk of false positive and false negative rates, fingerprint readers may not be ideal for extraordinarily high risk or high availability systems. So any system in which you have to have 100% accuracy may not be a great deployment for fingerprint readers. That said, recent studies have shown that implementing machine learning and neural networks can greatly increase their accuracy, getting them to much higher rates of positive acceptance. Next slide. In fingerprint reader user experience, because of their widespread use in smartphones and in laptop authentication, fingerprint readers are often users' most common experience with biometric authentication. Studies have shown that many existing fingerprint enrollment procedures built into smartphones and laptops do not adequately instruct users for proper enrollment, which can lead to false negatives where in subsequent authentication attempts they are not authenticated and not given access to their equipment, which can cause frustration. The user experience can vary widely depending on the implementation of the fingerprint hardware in any given scenario. Next slide.
Facial recognition introduction. So facial recognition utilizes your facial biometric information to create a 3D reference map. And what this does is when the scanner scans your face, when you're setting up the facial recognition, it saves this map for reference so that every time you unlock your device, it'll match the different pinpoints of what it's currently scanning versus what was saved as a secure match. Facial recognition is a secondary authentication method, and that you can't use, or it's not recommended to use, facial recognition by itself. There needs to be a fail-safe just because potentials for failures or user error if you're not scanning your face properly. You don't want to be locked out from your information. So using a PIN or a passcode is a great alternative if the facial recognition fails. That way you still get a chance to access the information you want to, and user error doesn't block you from that. This raises some privacy concerns from users, which include how is this data stored in reference to the reference map that is taken when you're setting up the device? How can this method be abused by a malicious actor? Who has access to their biometric information? And this implementation depends on its use case, i.e., is it for personal business and such? Next slide. Facial recognition deployments. So facial recognition utilizes the idea of what a person is being that your face is you. It's not something that you need to know. It's not something that you need to have physically, like a USB key. It's great for use on personal devices such as mobile phones and notebook computers have been seeing a rise in the use of facial recognition along with fingerprint readers. Facial recognition is also great for use of entry to buildings or entry into secure rooms, whether that's a back room in a small business that only managers or such need to access to, but it provides a fast, secure, and easy method of authentication that goes further than just a password. Next slide, please. So facial recognition cost of implementation. So when facial recognition started out, it was a very expensive method to try and implement, given that it's new and it was really only for enterprise use if they wanted to. But in recent years, the cost of implementing it has gone down due to increasing research and development into it, which came from the likes of Apple, LG, and companies like ZookSmart, who offer a $99 a month solution to small businesses. So this can be implemented with your small business or mobile devices. It utilizes equipment that's already in use, such as your LED flash to illuminate your face on a mobile device if it's nighttime. And it uses the cameras to scan your face or to make sure that the subject in being scanned is in frame, if you will, and make sure that you're in line with the sensor to know where you are. It also satisfies a cost benefit analysis as it can be or is usually more expensive than a simple pin box or password box or badge system, but you get the benefit that it's secure and private. It's secure in the sense that, like an ATM, you have to fear that someone can look over your shoulder and see your PIN. But with facial recognition, people can watch you scan. They can't take your face, if you will. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Facial recognition vulnerabilities. So during the early implementation of facial recognition, you could compromise the system by using fake deepfakes. And what deepfakes were are AI based methods of video processing where it would take a series of pictures of a subject and then create a new one or a new generated one, and that could be used to fool the system at a 95% success rate. And this has been combated by depth mapping, which so Apple uses their facial ID system, which has a special sensor, and it can't be fooled by a 2D surface. So you can't hold a picture up to the sensor and it pass, because it scans how far back is your eye from your nose, how far back is your ear from your eye, and it measures a 3D map that it saves as a reference point to combat the issue of deepfakes. It does rely on primary authentication methods in the event of failure, and with that meaning all the vulnerabilities that would come with using a PIN passcode system, facial ID or facial recognition does take on, being that if the facial recognition system fails, it will revert to the PIN passcode system to allow access of information. And studies have shown that with the newer system that Apple uses, the chance of a genuine lookalike out there in the world is about 1 to 1 million. Next slide, please. Facial recognition user experiences provides a fast, secure, and easy method to use. It's easy for users to learn and adapt to, being that they're not required to remember something and they're not required to always have something with them as a primary source. It does minimize user error, as I mentioned earlier, with the camera system that helps tell the subject to either move left or move higher if it's not in frame to help get a proper scan. The failure rate of facial recognition has gone down significantly since 2014, where it was 4% versus 0.2% in 2018. But once again, it does require additional authentication to prevent a full lockout. Next slide, please.
Now we will dive into iris scanners. Iris recognition is a type of biometric authentication that is becoming a widespread authentication technique. It uses visible and near-infrared light to take a high-contrast photo of a person's iris, which is the colored part of a person's eye. This method is more common than people realize, as it is used for everyday tasks such as unlocking your smartphone. Next slide. Deployments. Iris scanners are found in an abundance of locations to enforce two-factor authentication. They can be found in banks, prisons, and/or military security/identification facilities. Though it depends on a characteristic that varies between each individual, which is a big plus, they have their cons, such as several other authentication methods do. Next slide. Iris scanners have many capabilities, yet more features drive up costs like most products. Budget allocation security measures, such as biometric authentication measures, will more than likely outweigh the cost of a major security breach, which is more than likely why corporations, also smaller businesses, allow security teams to have big budgets. As we've seen in the past, there have been many security breaches that corporations have handled and paid millions and millions of dollars, whereas they could have definitely saved themselves that money if they would have just allocated the budget necessary to create cyber teams, which some corporations such as Target lacked until they had a cyber breach. With more than one supplier, having 14 different scanners to choose from, prices can range from $200 to $1,800 per unit. With most small equipment and products, buying in bulk also saves companies tons of money, which you can also do with iris scanners. When choosing on capabilities, they range from iris scanners being able to identify your iris from far away or up close. Also, the success failure rate as well, which is very, very key, and tying back into budget being allocated properly. Next slide. Vulnerabilities. Though it leans on a characteristic that varies per person, this does have its vulnerabilities. Iris scanners can definitely be vulnerable to iris spoofing. What is iris spoofing? It is reprinting an iris and trying to fool an iris scanner to make it seem like it matches another person. It can be done in the form of a high-resolution image, or more intimate forms of spoofing are creating an iris out of a polysulfide and trying to recreate characteristics of an eye, such as pupillary reflex and dilation, and also several other reflexes that an eye might exhibit when being scanned. Next slide. For user experiences, iris scanners are deemed to be pretty user-friendly, as it requires little recognition. Like face scanners that were talked about before by Xavier, a person just has to sit there and have their eye or face scanned. It requires nothing from the user. In the past, Samsung phones have had iris scanners deployed in them, and have stated that users have stated that iris scanners have created dizziness and eye pain. Samsung actually chalked this up to users misusing iris scanners by being too close or too far away from scanners, canceling out. Next slide.
Next, I'll be talking about universal two-factor. This is also known as security keys or a USB key. The idea of carrying around a key to get into a locked space has been around for centuries. Today, we take that idea into the digital realm with security keys. These are typically USB devices that can either generate or store unique authentication codes when logging in or accessing a system. Even with most of the common forms being USB drives, there are still many different forms of these keys. Some of the more recent popular ones have NFC and Bluetooth capabilities, while the older ones have a built-in screen to display a code that the user needs to type in. Having these physical keys and having these physical devices as an authentication method follows one of the three key types of authentication, and that's something that you have. Next slide, please. Most of the time, you will see these security keys in a business environment where a worker might be changing systems a lot, or like when a business traveler has to take a laptop with sensitive information on it. Having a physical device that almost instantly authenticates them after the password allows for a much more convenient workflow. Next slide, please. There are a few aspects that can determine the cost of security keys. If you are looking for one from the market, they can range anywhere from $25 to $70 with manufacturers such as Google and Yubico. If cost is an issue, there are open source varieties such as solo keys. Almost all of these options use the FIDO2 framework, and the keys range through all USB standards, allowing for use with mobile devices as well. Next slide, please. Currently, FIDO2 in security keys doesn't have any published vulnerabilities. However, that does not mean that it is the most secure framework ever. There's still possible vulnerabilities out there. The biggest issue we face with security keys is that the other sites and services are not as secure. Gaining access to other accounts may allow deactivation of two-factor authentication. This is an issue prevalent in all forms of authentication, not solely security keys. Physically losing the key is another issue that this method faces. If an attacker is able to steal or find one of these devices, they are able to basically complete half the puzzle that is getting into your account. And if the victim is specifically targeted, then it's much easier. Next slide, please. One of the most important things an authentication method can be is user-friendly. Through studies, users found that security keys were straightforward and easy to use. However, they were worried about the size being not durable or that it could easily break. Something that came up a lot was that people were worried about physically losing the keys or just forgetting the device entirely. This doesn't happen with other methods, while it does happen with others as well. Next slide.
Now to discuss. With each of the different multi-factor authentications and the different facets of their respective methods discussed in the presentation, it is key to derive which method is the best. And the common sentiment of security that it is only as strong as its weakest link, the most common susceptibility feature to all of these methods is user error by users not explaining and or executing proper usage of the authentication method. As Tom touched on earlier, abuse was one, and as Xavier talked on earlier, misuse is one as well, which feeds back into users not being able to explain or execute proper usage. If these methods are not used properly or correctly, they cannot work correctly, therefore causing a hole in a security system. Next slide.
The cost of implementation is always a large factor in whether a company adopts a certain authentication method. We found that RFID tags offer the least expensive option, coming in at 5 cents or less per tag. And even if you include RFID tag readers for every given tag, it would still be the most cost effective, coming in at $15. Having multi-factor authentication is only as good as if it's still being used by the user. If a user gets annoyed with said method, they may remove it. We found that using something you are, such as biometrics, is easier on the user as they never worry about forgetting or losing devices as in other methods. Next slide, please.
With our paper do come a few little limitations. One of them being a time constraint. This paper was completed in an academic setting, given that our research was done over 6 months, not over years. There is another limitation that we conducted this research with a limited sample. We decided to focus on 5 specific authentication methods, and there are a plethora of other methods that could be factored in as well. And for resources, our information came from either public information or users who have worked in the field. We didn't use information acquired on a first-hand source, such as interviewing a company and getting their feedback on their systems.
In conclusion, this research has provided a high-level overview of several of the most common multi-factor authentication methods. We conducted this research because one of the most vulnerable attack vectors for any organization, large or small, remains user account credentials. For each authentication method, the researchers conducted a review of published academic papers related to the topic and analyzed the authentication method through several lenses. This research has shown which deployments are effective for given scenarios, as well as potential limitations for each technology.